That we wanted to present a lesson tonight on a topic that was suggested, and that topic is the topic of covetousness. Covetousness. I think that's a deceptively complex topic because, it's obviously something that we've heard about all our lives. We know about that word, and we know that it's always condemned. In Romans chapter 1, for example, and in verse 28, when Paul is talking about just how degraded the world is and how that the Gentiles are so far in their conduct from God and pleasing God, they talk about the debased mind of those who do things that are not fitting. They're filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness. That's pretty bad company when you think about it. So to be covetous is obviously something God hates. And those who practice such things, he says, worthy of death. So he couldn't talk about it in stronger terms than he does here. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and in verse 9, Paul again talks about the unrighteous and how they'll not inherit the kingdom of God. And he gives a list there: wickedness, including fornicators and idolaters and adulterers and homosexuals and sodomites and thieves and covetous people. Now that's the classification that he places on the covetous. But what is it, this covetousness? What does it mean? Who is covetous? There's an old line from one of Shakespeare's plays where he says that desire of having is the sin of covetousness. That may sound smart, but I don't believe that's so, do you? Just the desire to have something? Does that make you covetous? If it does, then I don't know how to explain Matthew 15:28. When Jesus here is dealing with a Syrophoenician woman, and she desperately wants her daughter to be made whole, and comes to Jesus and endures a great deal to receive that gift. And Jesus said to her, "O woman, great is your faith, be it done as you desire." In fact, the word desire sometimes is used in reference to covetousness, and sometimes it's used in reference to what I believe would be considered a worthy and righteous desire. Or John 17, Jesus is praying there that prayer at the brook Kidron before he goes over to Gethsemane. Couldn't be more somber. And he prays, "Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you have given me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world." Jesus said, "I desire that my disciples be with me in that better place." Is that covetousness? I don't think we'd have the gall to charge the Lord with covetousness, nor Paul for that matter. In Romans chapter 10 and verse 1, he said, "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved." I want that so badly. That's my heart's desire and my prayer. So what does it mean to be covetous? As I said, I appreciate the suggestion. This came in the suggestion box back there. And some others maybe have had some questions and suggestions. I'm getting to them. I appreciate your patience. If I don't get to them quick enough, come and talk to me and say, "Hey, I had one in there too." But this has been helpful to me in thinking about the question, where are the boundaries? Where is the line from which one goes from simply desire to covetous? Well, I sat down and thought about, some of the characteristics that I think do fit within this period. This is a very simple lesson. It may not take me that long to tell you. I'm sure this is an incomplete list, I'll tell you that. But I don't think you'll disagree with the things that are on here. And so I want to think with you about some of the characteristics of covetousness in the Bible. Let me start out by looking at a passage in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5. And this is a pretty good description of covetousness, and maybe it's the first thing that came to your mind. Paul there talks about putting to death your members that are upon the earth: fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness. And then he said, which is idolatry. That's what covetousness is. It's idolatry. We know what idolatry is. It's the idea of bowing down and worshiping and serving false gods. He said that's exactly what covetousness is. When people bow down and worship and follow and put first in their life something besides God, he said that's what they covet. And that's idolatry. And that being the case, it really puts a different light to me on the Ten Commandments. You know, when you look back in Exodus and you see there the list of the Ten Commandments, one of the lists of the Ten Commandments, everybody remembers the first commandment. The first commandment is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Remember what the 10th commandment is? Thou shalt not covet. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, or his manservant, or his maidservant, or his ox, or his ass, or anything that is thy neighbor. And in that sense, the first and 10 commandments are really this sort of different sides of the same coin. He starts out by saying, nobody but God. No gods but me. And he ends the 10 commandments by saying, nothing before me. And I think that's what the Lord was talking about. He didn't use the word covetous. But in Matthew 6 and verse 24, he reminds us there that no man can serve two masters. He'll hate the one and love the other, hold the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. That thing in your life that you want more than anything is your God. And he says there, there can only be one. So, the sin of covetousness involves certain things that I think we recognize, and we may see sometimes in our own behavior and thinking. In the first place, covetousness often involves desiring what is evil, what is condemned and wrong in and of itself. But it may not always be the case. It may involve something that's not evil in and of itself, but something that we have no right to. And coupled with that, it involves desiring something so much that we put it ahead of doing what's right. That is, we're willing to compromise principle because this is what matters to me more than anything else. Now, that can involve a lot of different things. Let me give you an example from the Scriptures to help illustrate what I'm talking about. Let's go back to the Old Testament just a moment and look at a man who began with such promise as a king of Judah. His name was Uzziah. And you remember his story. Now, Uzziah was a reformer. Uzziah came during a time when people needed someone to point to God, and he had done so and had a great and successful beginning of his reign. He warred against the Philistines. God helped him in that battle. He subdued the Ammonites. He built towers in Jerusalem. He was a man of great power. He had, verse 13, an army of 300,000 plus men of war, well equipped and well armed. A lot of great things about the beginning of Uzziah's reign, but all we remember about him is the way it ended, or the way it turned, maybe I should say. Verse 16 of this chapter reads, but when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction. For he transgressed against the Lord his God and went into the temple of the Lord to burn incense upon the altar of incense. Now, you know enough about the Old Testament to know how outrageous this is. I have no idea when this started, but at some point in time, Uzziah thought he was just so high and so lifted up and so close to God, he said, the rules don't apply to me. And I don't know why I can't go in there. And he became obsessed with this idea. And he said, I'm just going to do it. I'm the king. Who's going to stop me? I'm going to burn incense in the tabernacle. Maybe he had just for a long time looked at that and thought, I'd love to be a part of that. I want to do that. And he said, now today's my day. This became his obsession. It wasn't right, but that didn't matter to him. This is something he had to do. So he did. Azariah the priest, verse 17, went in after him, and 80 priests of the Lord, valiant men, and they withstood Uzziah the king, and said to him, It appertaineth not unto thee, Uzziah, to burn incense unto the Lord, but to the priests, the sons of Aaron, that are consecrated to burn incense. Go out of the sanctuary, thou hast trespassed, neither shall it be for thine honor from the Lord God. Uzziah was wroth, he was angry. Who do you think you're talking to? He had the censer in his hand to burn the incense, and while he was there in his anger, arguing with these priests, maybe threatening the men, that's when the leprosy came up on his forehead. And boy, things got different then. The priests saw that he was leprous in his forehead, and they thrust him out, and by that point in time, he was ready to go himself. But it was too late. Now, the text tells us that Uzziah spent the rest of his life and the rest of his reign as a leper, separated from society in that regard. That's covetousness. It wasn't a matter of money involved in it, but it certainly was covetousness. Maybe something that's more in line with what we normally think of. We think of that story over in Joshua chapter 7. And the people of Israel under Joshua have come into the land of Canaan, and the first great obstacle to their taking Canaan is the big city of Jericho. And God has special plans for Jericho. And I'll tell you what's going to happen is you're going to take Jericho in a way that nobody will ever forget. It will not be a normal military campaign. This will be something that will make it obvious to anybody with eyes that God is working. March around the city and the walls will fall down. Well, the Lord also made it plain when he told them what to do. He said, look, this city and what in it belongs to me. This is the first fruits, and it's mine. And so in chapter 6 and in verse 17, the city shall be accursed, even it, and all that are therein to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all that are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And ye in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed thing, lest ye make yourselves accursed when ye take of the accursed thing, and make the camp of Israel accursed, and trouble it. But all the silver and the gold and the vessels and the bronze and the iron are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. That's mine, God said. You keep your hands off of it. Well, you remember the 7th chapter. There was a guy, man of Judah, whose name was Achan. And he took what belonged to God in direct violation of what God had told him and warned about. And he describes it here in terms that we've read through the years. When he's caught, pointed out by God later, he says to Joshua, explaining himself, he said in verse 21 of chapter 7, he said, I saw the spoils and that goodly Babylonian garment and 200 shekels of silver and a wedge of gold and 50 shekels weight. And he said, I coveted them and I took them. I knew it wasn't right, but I had to have them. Had to have them. That's his God. His God were these things. And of course, he paid a high price for those things and for holding them for just a moment. But that's the nature of covetousness. It just is so obsessed with something, it's got to have it, and principle doesn't matter, and right and wrong doesn't matter. That's what covetousness looks like. Whether it's a Babylonian garment, or whether it might be some privilege or some rank that does not belong to us. Something else about covetousness that defines it, I think, and distinguishes it from just desire, is its desire that does not include thankfulness. Thankfulness is what we already have. And it's also that which makes contentment impossible without the thing desired. There's a story we were looking at in our Bible class in Numbers chapter 11 that comes to mind. If you turn back to Numbers 11, the setting here, you remember, is the Israelites are making their way from Sinai up toward the promised land. And it ought to have been a joyous time. It ought to be a time when Israel was filled with hope and filled with thanksgiving. They were anything but. They'd been walking a few days and their feet got sore and their complaining got so bad that God sent fire down to destroy many of them. And then in verse 4, the mixed multitude that was among them fell a-lusting. He doesn't identify who this mixed multitude was. Probably they were some of the folks that came up with Israel out of Egypt. Might have been other nations that had been enslaved that when Israel was released, they attached themselves and went with them. Anyhow, they fell a-lusting. They became covetous for something. And of course, he explains it in the next sentence. The children of Israel wept again, and they said, "Who shall give us flesh to eat?" They weren't covetous. They weren't lusting for gold or for sex or for power or whatever. They were lusting for meat, particularly. They said, "We've been eating this manna." They've been eating the manna about a year. God sent manna. They didn't have to plant it. They didn't have to reap it. They just went and picked it up off the ground. And they could take those flakes and they could turn them into all kinds of foods, and it would sustain them and fill them. Well, they were so sick of that. And they said, "Oh, I wish we had it good like we did down in Egypt, where we could eat the fish and all the vegetables. And oh, it was so great. This manna, our soul just drives away at this manna." Not exactly what I'd call thankful, was it? And they became just obsessed with this idea of having meat, something else to eat. And Moses heard the people weep. Verse 10, "Every man at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was greatly kindled, and Moses was displeased." And that's where you remember Moses said to the Lord, he said, "What did God do to you that you put me in charge of all these people? These are all my kids. I got to carry them around. Just kill me now, rather than watch me turn into wretchedness." And the Lord was patient with Moses at this point. And he made an arrangement for these 70 elders, you remember, to be selected so they might help bear the burden for Moses in the wilderness, or in this traveling as they were making their way at this time to Canaan. But Moses was told, he said, "I'm going to also answer the people." Now, he was quite upset, the Lord was, with the people's discontentedness and unthankfulness. And he said to him, he said, verse 18, "You tell the people to sanctify themselves against tomorrow. By this time tomorrow, they'll be eating flesh. They'll have meat to eat." And he said, they're not going to have it just one day, or 2 days, or 5 days, or 10 days, or 20 days. They're going to eat it for a month. They're going to eat it till it runs out their nose. Now, sometimes you push your parents enough that you get that kind of response to where they say, "Okay, that's what you want?" Well, they had done that with God. That's a dangerous place to be. It wasn't just that they requested it. It was that they were so obsessed with this that they had forgotten the blessings of God. And that's exactly what happened, by the way. That verse 31 tells us that there was a wind from the Lord that brought quail from the sea and let them fall by the camp, as it were a day's journey on this side and a day's journey on the other side. It seemed like you could just walk for a day, and as far as you could go, there'd be quail piled up 3 feet high. And they went out to gather them. I mean, he that gathered least gathered, just bushels of these quail. And they stayed up all night and all the next day, drying these things out and getting them prepared. And apparently they'd begun to eat them. And then verse 33 says something quite unusual, doesn't it? It says that while the flesh was yet between their teeth, ere it was chewed, The wrath of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord smote the people with a very great plague. And they called the name of this place Kibroth-hattaavah, which is to say the graves of those that lusted, the graves of the greedy. Why did God give them meat and strike them dead for eating it? He doesn't explain. We have to read between the lines here. I could be wrong. But I picture this as being people who have learned nothing. They complained about the manna that God provided. They complained in such a way as to doubt God's goodness. And then when God gave them this gift, there's no indication any of them had the slightest bit of thanksgiving or remorse for the way they had acted. And the Lord punished them for that. Here's a person so obsessed with something that they're not going to be happy without it. And even when they get it, they think not one thing about God and thanksgiving, but rather they just think about the next thing that they want. That's covetousness in its essence. It reminds us of that passage in 1 Timothy chapter 6, doesn't it? Verse 3. Maybe this is another passage that comes to your mind when you think about this subject. Paul had been telling Timothy that to teach Christ involves teaching people to sacrifice and to be restrained and self-controlled. And he said, if anybody teaches otherwise and does not consent to wholesome words, if somebody is trying to sell people on an easy way, just understand that those people are proud, they don't know anything, they have corrupt minds, destitute of the truth. They suppose that godliness is a means of gain. All they think about is material things, he said. From such withdraw thyself. And then he teaches the lesson that godliness with contentment is great gain. We brought nothing into this world. It is certain that we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. There's that word again, contentment. Let me tell you something that covetous people can never be is content. They can never be content, satisfied. Those that desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful lusts which drown men in destruction and perdition. They're chasing after things, they never enjoy what they have, and they're headed over the cliff. He says that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Paul preached contentment. He preached being thankful for what you have and being balanced in the way that you live and in your attitude toward things. Now, easy for you to say, Paul? Not really. Paul had experienced life and the hard edges of life more than most of us have. That's for sure. When he wrote Philippians, he was writing from prison. But this is what he wrote to a church that had sent help to him in some form. He said, I'm thankful, but I want you to know that I'm not begging for help here. And it's not just the help that I'm grateful for. He said, I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. And I'm not speaking in respect of need. For I have learned, he said, in whatever situation I am, to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. When Paul wrote about contentment, he wasn't just talking. He was telling you the way he lived, and he was telling you the secret to happiness in life and godliness. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 8, he's not talking about money here, but another thing that he desired greatly. 3 times, Paul writes, I pled with the Lord about this. This thorn in the flesh is what he's talking about, you remember. whatever that was, let's just say for a moment it was some physical ailment, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. Is it wrong to desire to be healthy? I don't think so. I hope not. I think we can find examples in the Bible of people praying for the health of other folks. It's not wrong to pray for your own health. Is it wrong to want to have enough to eat or enough to clothes to wear in the wintertime? No, I don't think that's wrong, to have that desire. But I'll tell you what Paul's talking about is the spirit that says whatever comes, it shall be well. I'll share a lesson with you. I'll share an example with you, I should say, that I came across recently. When my wife was going through cancer years ago, she met online on Facebook a lady, a Christian out in Texas, who had the same kind of cancer. And so they sort of bonded. And though we'd never met, she would all the time be talking to her, and they were encouraging each other. And through the years, this has been 10 plus years, this lady and her sort of continuing story would occasionally be shared with me. So we kept up with this lady. She saw that cancer go into remission. But then she had another bout with that cancer. And another remission. But health problems that came from that. And I'm not trying to tell her story. I'm not going to mention her name. But anyway, she and her husband had to move from where they had been for a long time. There was a job that he had had for years that turned out he got sort of dumped out through no fault of his own, had to restart, moved northern part of Texas. And as it turns out, they were members. We didn't know it till after we'd already agreed to come. They were members of the church where we went to the meeting, so we got to meet them in person for the first time. They moved into a house up there, and it's one of those situations, you ever been in a case like this where somebody buys a house and, it looks like a dream come true, and then you find out that the house has got all kind of problems that somehow the inspector missed and nobody told you about. And they had to spend a lot of money trying to fix this house up. But they did. And then while we were there, they were going through this, one of the members of the church there had a house that was not too far from where they were living, and it had a pool. And this good sister, part of her rehab is working and exercising in the pool, really be a help to her. And she thought, boy, this would be so great. We'll sell this house and we'll move up the street and we'll buy this house. It'll be so good. But you have to sell your house first. And this lady's got to sell her house. So you've got a window there. And while we were there, they had a couple that came. They'd been trying to sell this house for some time. This one couple came back 3 times. And we were praying with them while we were there that maybe the Lord would answer and maybe they can sell this house so they can get this other house. And we found out after we got home that didn't happen. And so, and I don't have it before me, and I just heard Donna tell me one time. But they decided, this couple did, to take their house off the market. The other house was gone. Had to be sold to somebody else. And this good lady who'd been through a lot in her life said something along this line. She said, when we pray, we always pray the Lord's will be done. And we know what that means. It means sometimes the answer is no. And she said, after all this long struggle, we have decided that the answer is no. But it is well. Yeah, that's right. That's the difference in desire and covetousness. I think it has to do with contentment. Let me mention something else that I think is involved in covetousness. Covetousness does not consider the consequences that come to others. Their desire is all that matters. One obvious example that comes to mind is the story of King Ahab. What can you say about King Ahab that's not bad? Well, the Lord, surely, if you look at his story, doesn't the Lord try over and again, trying to draw something good out of Ahab, but he's too weak and too selfish, and he's married to a woman that is certainly no help to him. So anyway, the story in chapter 21, you remember, is that the king's got a palace up in Jezreel in the north part of the country, and there's a vineyard right next to his place that's owned by a guy named Naboth, and he tries to buy it from him, and Naboth won't sell. He won't sell because he says, this is my inheritance of the Lord. So what happens is Ahab gets mad about it and pouts about it, comes home and turns his face to the wall and won't eat. And that's when Jezebel comes in. If you're here in 1 Kings 21, verse 5, Jezebel, his wife, came to him and said, what's the matter with you? Why are you so down? Why won't you eat? And then he tells her the reason why. Look at verse 7. Jezebel, his wife, said unto him, dost thou now govern the kingdom of Israel? Are you the king or not? Rise up and eat bread. Let your heart be merry. You're going to have this vineyard soon enough. She didn't tell him how. He didn't want to know. He didn't care. He was perfectly glad to let her handle it, and what she did was she wrote letters in his name, you remember, to the people, the officials where Naboth lived, and had him set up, had him falsely accused, and had him stoned to death, murdered. And it was there then that word got back to her, well, this fellow's dead. And so she goes into her husband and says, guess what? That vineyard just came open. It's yours now. And he's out there and he's just having a big old time. Oh, he's looking at his vineyard. And that's when the Lord sent Elijah to him to say, verse 19, hast thou killed and taken possession? And thou shalt speak unto him, saying, thus saith the Lord, in the place where the dogs licked the blood of Naboth, the dogs shall lick thy blood, even thine. Old King Ahab, he didn't care where that vineyard came from as long as it came to him, and he didn't care who got hurt, but he cared later. Ahab is an easy target, I suppose. It's harder for me to read the story that took place a few years earlier during the reign of King David, when David looked out his window and he saw a woman that he desired, and he asked who she was, and he was told, this woman is the wife of one of your servants. But by that point in time, he coveted her. And that became his God, and the only thing that mattered to him. Just like with Ahab, it was a vineyard, and just like it was the Israelites in the wilderness, it was, I've got to have flesh to eat, and this means more than anything else, and I don't care what else happens, I've got to have it. And it was covetousness that led the king to do unspeakable things. One more thing that I'll mention to you that's a characteristic of covetousness. It is that the covetous spirit always forgets that all material things are temporary. That's another characteristic of covetousness. The great story in Luke chapter 12 comes to mind. In this passage, there's a huge crowd that's gathered to hear Jesus speak. This is toward the end of his reign, end of his ministry, I should say. And huge crowds are there. And he's been teaching them some very pointed, sober lessons. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. And he had been talking to them about hell. People today, they shy away from the doctrine of hell. You know this to be true. It might surprise some people that have not read the Bible as carefully, but Jesus had more to say about hell than any other speaker in the New Testament. If you look at the word Gehenna and all the times it's used, every time but one, it's the Lord that uses the word. And he's preaching on hell, among other things. And then you got this guy in the crowd that says, I wish you'd tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Okay. The Lord didn't help him to find his inheritance from his brother, but he helped him in a way that he really needed. He said, beware of covetousness. A man's life consists not in the abundance of the things he possesses. And he told us an unforgettable story that we've all heard about a man, a rich man, whose ground brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, he said, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to put all this stuff I'm getting. I've got such a crop, he said, I just have to tear down my barns and build greater. And then I'll be set. Then I can, for many years, I just sit back, eat, drink, and be merry. And God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which thou hast provided? And then he offered this thought. He said, so is he that lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Chasing after things. But what's it worth? What's it worth? At what cost? Cost you your family? Cost you your soul? Don't you think about Ananias and Sapphira? Oh, it was an exciting time in the church at Jerusalem. There were many in need, and there was much generosity. And Ananias and Sapphira thought, well, you know, we want to help, but we don't want to help that much. So everybody's selling these lands and giving the price. We'll sell our land, and we'll give part of the price and tell them we gave all of it. There was nothing wrong with giving part of it. But they also were proud, you know, and they wanted that glory, whatever glory they thought was there, from men. And it didn't fool the Holy Spirit. And Peter said to Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Ghost? And of course he was struck dead. And about 3 hours later his wife comes in, doesn't know what's happened. She tells the same lie. She's struck dead. Boy, I don't know how much money they hid away from this deal. Was it worth it? Was it worth it? I wish I could never forget this lesson, and I wish everybody that I meet, I could teach them in a way they would never forget this lesson. If you never make $100,000 a year, if you don't make $50,000 a year, and you drive both cars the rest of your life, and you never own a house, you can have success in life in the ways that count. I'm not saying you have to be poor to go to heaven. But I'm telling you, whatever it is that's got my attention to the point where I'm putting God to the side, let it go. Let it go. Don't you think these folks wish they could try that again? I appreciate the kind way that you've listened. Ecclesiastes. No, Ephesians is what I'm trying to say. Chapter 5, verse 3. It's where we'll end tonight. That's where Paul wrote to these good brethren, and he said that fornication and all uncleanness and covetousness, let it not be named once among you as becomes saints. There's no room in the kingdom of God to shame the name of God with fornication. And there's no room to shame him with covetousness. May the Lord help us. Help me to learn that lesson. I appreciate your kind attention. Please get out the songbook, turn to the number that's been selected.